First You Think is a not-for-profit ministry of the First Unitarian Church of Des Moines. Support us at ucdsm.org today.
I'm Mike Smith. I found a home in this church about 37 years ago. My story starts about 20 years ago. I was driving and listening to public radio, and I caught an interview with a therapist who was talking about morbidly shy boys who didn't learn social skills until they were in early adulthood. And I thought, oh, that was what was wrong with me. And actually, that short interview didn't talk about the underlying causes, and I've had reason since to think about those underlying causes. In any event, I was a timid boy. At recess or lunch break at Waukee School in about 1950, I was the last chosen for Cowboys and Indians. What does that tell you about timidity? I had no athletic ability. I almost failed first grade, but then I became a reader. Oh, thanks. At about 12, I became cynical about Judeo-Christian myth, which I interpreted as the big lie about pie in the sky. And about 13, I became morbidly self-conscious around girls, aggravated by bad acne. I was too mortified to talk with girls about anything other than safe subjects, I guess. I was a lazy student. My only skill was multiple choice tests. I was depressed, and I was increasingly depressed. I enrolled at Drake University at age 17, emotional age about 12, deepening depression, couldn't concentrate. I was in and out of Drake. And this was the early 60s. I was working minimum wage jobs to support myself because my family had paid part of the first year's tuition, and they then gave up on me. And the draft was looming. I was convinced the U.S. military was propping up a corrupt dictatorship in Vietnam. And then in the fall of 1965, the draft caught up with me. I got a notice to take a physical. I passed. And then I got a new 1A classification card and a notice to report for military induction. I thought about this a while, and I just simply tore my cards in two and my induction notice in two, and I carefully put my return address on the envelope, and I mailed them to the Dallas County Draft Board. Then the deal was made. I call this the evasion deal. Unbeknownst to me, my parents met with the draft board, and they worked out the deal. If I would get treatment, they would reclassify me 4F, unfit for service. They didn't say what treatment was. The cynical part of me thought they probably wanted a lobotomy or at least electroshock, but I really don't think they cared. They just didn't want trouble. So they mailed me new cards, a new registration card, a new classification card, 4F. And I did see a clinical psychologist every couple of weeks, a guy named William Eckhart. Probably, I know one of his children was involved in the black armband case that went to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1969. It was decided by the U.S. Supreme Court, Tinker versus Des Moines School Board. Anyway, I didn't like the deal, and so I tore up that new classification card and my registration card, and I mailed them to the Dallas County Draft Board. And they ran out of patience. And so the next stage was prosecution. It was an immense relief to tear up those cards and put them in the mail. But, page 2, I gave up evasion for resistance. So I was prosecuted for the crime of failing to report for military induction. The shorthand description of that is draft evasion. The irony wasn't lost on me and it was painful. In the Milwaukee community where I had gone to school from K to 12, there was some talk I was a coward on the run and had got caught. I was sentenced by a federal judge who was also a brigadier general in the Air Force Reserve, maybe completely irrelevant. He sentenced me to only 4 years instead of the maximum 5 because, he told my attorney, he thought I was crazy. I was headed to prison in early 1967, and maybe I was too depressed to be afraid. I just felt a brooding dread about a worse time coming. And then there's this little episode here. With me went the pre-sentence investigation report, which noted that I didn't have a girlfriend and expressed concern that I might be homosexual or bisexual. The official who wrote the report cautioned me to stay out of the prison weight room. Shortly after I arrived at the prison facility, an internal parole officer talked to me about the report and expressed concern about my sexual orientation based on the report. I asked him to judge me by my behavior. I later learned from another inmate that inmates working in a prison administrative office have access to the inmate files. So other inmates knew that my pre-sentence investigation report said I might be AC/DC. That was the terms in which the inmate explained that to me. You wouldn't have to be paranoid to think that they were messing with me. And I was 140 pounds, 5'8", couldn't punch my way out of a paper bag, was considered by some to be cute. So those are the circumstances I went into prison. What was it like? Well, I was very lucky. It was safe. I went to the Sandstone Federal Correctional Institute at Sandstone, outside of Sandstone, Minnesota. About 450 inmates, gun towers, razor wire, but the guards ran the place. The inmates didn't. There weren't any gangs. I was never assaulted. I never was in a fight. I got an education, and it was an important education. About half the population, nearly half the population, were black guys from Minneapolis, the Twin Cities, and Chicago. And I wound up living in a black cell house, mainly the black cell. It was mainly black. There were 2 cell houses, kind of de facto segregation. The black cell house was my home. The black guys respected us few draft resistors as political prisoners because of black guys that were doing 5 years for selling a dime bag of marijuana. And I never understood why they were federally prosecuted for that, but they were. They felt they were political prisoners, and I thought they were too. And the Native Americans that were there, man, their stories broke my heart. So I did go to the weight room. I got stronger. I put on about 15 pounds of muscle. It didn't make any difference, but I felt more confident. But all the time I struggled with being complicit. So, I found that my fellow resistors all struggled with being complicit. A psychiatrist studied about 3 dozen of us that were in 3 different institutions, and he said every man struggled with being complicit during their time in jail. We admired Melville's character, Bartleby the Scrivener. Although Bartleby, who said, I prefer not to cooperate in various ways until he starved himself to death, wasn't going to be a role model for us. Unlike Bartleby, we cared too much about our own lives to starve ourselves to death. What were the impacts of that resistance? This talk actually was to be about resistance 2 weeks ago, but I had gout. There were 3.2 million Americans sent to Vietnam. There were 3,200 of us convicted of not going, basically for resisting the draft. About half of that 3,200 were probably Jehovah's Witnesses, which were on had a whole different worldview. What impacts did our resistance have? I think essentially none on the policy, on the war. Our acts of resistance changed nothing, but they changed us. And just lately I've thought about resilience, and there was resilience. The 2 lowest times for me were just before I went in and just after I came out. I was paroled in 1969, Richard Nixon, newly in office. The Johnson Parole Board is who let me out. I was still very depressed. I was paroled to a country still at war. I came back to Des Moines. I went to work on a graveyard shift in a warehouse. I experimented with every illegal drug I could get my hands on and there were drugs there then. This was 1969. And I then had a relationship with a woman leading to my first marriage, which lasted 14 years. And I worked. I just worked and worked. I worked in the warehouse. I drove a truck 20 hours a week out of Des Moines and re-enrolled in University of Iowa as an undergraduate, went on to law school. And after law school, lucked into a state job as a hearing officer. I hadn't taken the bar exam because I was afraid they wouldn't let me. I waited 7 years. In 1983, I applied to take the bar exam. Bar examiners wouldn't let me. You know what their worry was? I might embarrass the profession by an act of civil disobedience, like maybe pouring blood on the gates at Offutt Air Force Base. I appealed to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court had different views of that. I was allowed to take the bar. I passed. I spent the rest of my career at the Attorney General's office. And that's the end of this story, which is in large part a story of good luck, but also maybe some resilience that I didn't know was in me. Gradually, I became alive to people, to relationships, to the wonder of wild nature that just I felt joy and wonder and that I never was able to experience before. We are in a perilous time now. I don't know how our resilience will be tested. I think it will. I think what we're doing to try to understand it is important.
Hey. Good morning. I'm Barb Royal. I use she, her pronouns. I have been blessed with an amazing life, one without major trauma or losses. No one has ever beaten me. I've never had a life-threatening disease. I've never been poor or homeless. I've not had to overcome a disability. I've never lost a child. And no, I'll knock on wood several times and throw salt over my shoulder and anything else I can do to avoid being jinxed by saying those things. My first thought about our topic this month, resilience, was that I've never experienced anything I needed to be resilient about. But after thinking about this for a bit longer, I realized that resilience isn't just about those kinds of major life disruptions like I mentioned above. It's also about the day-to-day kinds of setbacks or hurts or challenges that we can all experience. Resilience is the quality that we all have that helps us get through every single day without letting minor incidents or even very painful events turn into major obstacles that interfere with our ability to continue to put one foot in front of the other, to get on with living. As I looked back on my life, I began to think of times when I have faced challenges, and I realized that all challenges, big or small, call for some level of resilience. So here are a few examples from my life. 1991, I was getting divorced from John, whom many of you remember, after 20 years together and with 2 small children. Even though I was the one who wanted the divorce, it was a difficult decision and an emotional path to walk. We had been dealing with all sorts of issues for several years and had been working to resolve those on our own and with a therapist. Eventually, I decided that getting divorced would be better for me and for the kids. Voluminous journaling and the support of our friends in this congregation and a therapist got me through. Luckily, we managed to have an amicable divorce, and with relatively few glitches along the way, he became the best ex-husband a person could ask for. We remained engaged with each other's families, and his relatives still consider me and my wife Deidre part of their family. 1977, I'm working backwards. A huge challenge then was coping with the death of my dad, whom I worshipped and whose wisdom and unconditional love I depended on. I was 30 at the time. I couldn't imagine not being able to talk to him again, to not have him there to help me when I'd lose perspective, to not be able to ask him questions or to share the daily joys and sorrows of my life. I was devastated, but I knew my mother had to be suffering even more. They had had an almost idyllic marriage for 37 years, and here she was at 57, having lost the love of her life. I had to focus some of my energy on supporting Mom. I had the support of a husband. I had the support of a husband and friends, and I journaled and journaled again. And I started talking to my dad and asking myself questions like, what would Dad say? And I still do that to this day. Finally, 1970. I got into a relationship just as I was graduating from college. I was graduating late in December of 1969 because I had a senior thesis to complete and I had to take a movement class to complete my PE requirement because I couldn't broad jump my height. Sorry. I was also working part-time for a small nonprofit that I had helped to found with a group of students called STASH, the Student Association for the Study of Hallucinogens. This was 1969, as Mike was careful to point out. But that's another story for another time. Late that fall, I was introduced to a man, a townie, who ran a bar in our small college town. He was older. He had never been to college. I was white, well, I still am, and he was black. He was divorced and had 2 small children. I was incredibly naive, and I fell madly in love with him. I decided to stay in Beloit after completing my graduation requirements in order to continue working for Stash, or so I told myself. And with a BA in sociology and no idea what to do next, why not? Friends later told me that everyone knew I was staying because of Clarence. He moved in with me, I helped him in the bar, and we began planning for a future together. And I gradually began uncovering the lies, including that he was not, in fact, divorced. After each discovery, he would have all sorts of reasons why he had told that particular lie and promised never to lie again. But over the 6 months that we were together, my discoveries of the lies started getting closer and closer together. I describe it as a feeling akin to labor pains. The revelations became more frequent and more painful until I finally ejected myself from the relationship and from Beloit. I loaded everything I owned into my VW Squareback. The days of freedom when everything you owned fit in a car. And I came home to my parents in Des Moines. I was heartbroken and hurt and disappointed and embarrassed. But I had 2 loving parents who helped me regain perspective on myself and the choices I'd made and what we had each done and why. I swore I would never settle in Des Moines. But while trying to figure out what I wanted to do next, I accepted a 2-week temp job to fill in for a clerk in the personnel office at Broadlawns Hospital, where my dad worked. That turned into a permanent job as an assistant to the personnel director. I got my own apartment, and my parents introduced me to some wonderful young people who were on staff at Drake University, where my mother was working. I started getting engaged in the larger community by volunteering for Youthline, where young people could phone in and have someone who would listen and help them work through their issues. Friendships flourished, my hurt diminished, and I knew I would be okay. What I've always seen in all of these stories is luck. The luck of having supportive and understanding parents who could help me gain and maintain perspective, including noticing and appreciating what was positive in my life. I also see connection. I was able to connect with other people and develop a supportive community. And I see giving back. Turning some of my attention outward in trying to help others reinforce my belief that I too could heal. All of these things, luck, support, connection, giving back, have contributed to my own resilience. Thanks.